what criteria are they going to use to make their decision? And we don't really have a playbook for that. You don't start new courts every day. And so these judges are going to have to state some criteria that make it look like they're making an intelligent and thoughtful choice and not just throwing darts at the wall. When you start a court by breaking it off from another one, you've got a bunch of law built in. The earlier court has all this precedent. But here, you've got the 15th Court of Appeals starting with 0.
Thanks for tuning in to Keep It Legal, the show where we break down concepts, litigation, and current events with our legal experts. I'm your host, Mark Anik. Joining us today is one of the top appellate lawyers in Texas, David Coale, with Lynn Pinker Hurst Schwegmann here in Dallas. David, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
I need to read to people something from your bio, and I need your comment on it. This is from your own webpage right here that I've printed out in front of me. Widely recognized, one of the top appellate lawyers in Texas. I think we said that. But this is my favorite line. He is among the few lawyers to have handled a matter in all 14 of the Texas Intermediate Appellate Courts.
True.
Okay. And is the only known Texas appellate lawyer who's been fictionalized in a romance novel series as the lawyer for an outlaw motorcycle gang.
Yes, my wife is also a lawyer. She has a solo practice, David Coale, and she represents romance novelists. And one of her first and good clients, Joanna Wild, has a series called the Reaper series about an outlaw motorcycle gang. Joanna and I got to be friends, and she wrote in a character called Dobie, D-O-B-I-E, Coles, the big, dumb, good old boy who was still a brilliant lawyer. And I have blown up in my office wall the paragraph in the book Reaper's Fire where Dobie introduces himself to bail the hero out of jail. So if law doesn't work out, I can always become a fictional character, I guess.
I love that. Absolutely. And I love that it's on the wall in your office.
Or where else would it be? Got something like that, you got to go with it.
You're gracious enough to join us today to talk about a number of things going on in Austin at the Texas Legislature and the manner in which those items may or may not impact businesses and individuals here in Texas. And this is not new to you. You are people listening in, our audience, when they hear the name David Coale, they may recognize that you from time to time pop up on TV and in newspapers providing some perspective on news of the day.
Yes, I owe the opportunity to do that to your firm. The Androvet firm enabled me to get to know some folks in media and continues to do that. And I've developed over the years several contacts in TV and in the print. And it's funny, weeks will go by and really nothing of any interest happens. And then a major court decision will come out. It's 24/7, everybody wants to talk about it. And I think that's I've been really pleased to see that people on the media side of the dialogue really want to get it right and want to spend time with you just talking about the issue, even if they don't use a clip of you. And people are tuning in. They're not putting this stuff on the air so people will run off. They're putting it on the air because people want to learn more about these issues they hear about. And so I think it's fun for one thing, but I think it's an important part of making sure our democracy works the right way is just knowing what the heck is going on.
It's funny that you say that about reporters wanting to get it right. A million years ago, I worked as a reporter, and now when I speak to lawyers and others and try to get them ready for interviews, I always tell them one of my biggest fears was not that I would miss a deadline or that somebody else would beat me on a story. It was that I might not be correct in the information I was passing along. And as a reporter, you never, ever want to be in that position.
Sure, that parallels the legal profession. I mean, you want to win and represent your client well, but in order to do that and in order to have a credible professional reputation for the next case that comes along, you can't be seen as someone that cuts corners, that says things that are not true. And so, for years and years in law school and professional training, I've practiced, my partners practice, getting it right, getting the details in place, getting the facts straight. And reporters do the same thing. It's in a different forum and for different reasons, but it's the same stock in trade. They're not going to get very far in the world if they have great flashy stories, but no one believes what they say. It's just not going to work.
I want to talk about we've had a number of big stories come out of Austin over the last couple of weeks, and I think the biggest of them is the impeachment of our Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton. Just doing a little bit of reading today. This is only the third time under this Texas Constitution that the House has impeached a state officer. In this case, 20 articles of impeachment, bribery, conspiracy, abuse of office, et cetera, obstruction of justice. What happens in our system, just very broadly, what happens in our system when the person who is the top legal officer, and this is somebody who's already under indictment, state securities fraud charges going back 7 years or more, what happens when the top legal officer is impeached?
Well, there's a quick procedural answer to the question, and there's a more difficult sort of philosophical question. The procedural answer is easy. Our state constitution says that if the House moves to indict you, moves to impeach you, passes articles of impeachment, you are suspended from office. Boom. So the second the House had their vote a week or two ago, that was it. He was suspended. His key didn't work anymore in the office probably, and he has to go do something else with his time besides be Attorney General. I say that because that's not the way it works at the federal level. We've had a couple of impeachments in recent years, and the president's kept right on being the president. And that's a very important difference between how our state procedure works and how our national procedure works. But your question about the head law enforcement officer being himself under indictment and under the scrutiny of impeachment raises a question about the difference between the criminal and the political. I mean, Mr. Paxton's been under indictment for some time, and he's had a lot of civil litigation following him around as well. The people of Texas, generally aware of what those claims are, have returned him to office. And so the question that impeachment poses now is, do his problems in the world of litigation, criminal and civil litigation, that the voters didn't think were disqualifying, have they nevertheless become politically unacceptable? So much so that we're going to use the kind of the ultimate off-ramp under our Constitution and invoke the impeachment process.
Did it surprise you at all, given our recent history with the Attorney General and his history going back the several years, as you mentioned, and the prior indictment? Did it surprise you at all that this finally came to pass at the end of May?
Yes and no. He is the ultimate survivor. People have made all sorts of accusations about him in all kinds of places, and they just seem to fall off of him. And that's a credit to his political skills. What seems to have made the difference, and why it's not entirely surprising, is that he settled some of his civil litigation, not all, but just some of it, and wanted the legislature to pay $3.5 million or somewhere around $3 million to fund that settlement. That request to the legislature seems to have rubbed a lot of people the wrong way. I think a lot of people were willing to let it slide and willing to kind of look the other way, but once you're talking about spending a lot of money to only fix part of your problems, for various reasons, people thought that was a step too far, it seems.
Do you think, had he paid that $3.3 million out of his own pocket or the pockets of some political supporters, that perhaps we would not be here today?
It certainly would have helped. I mean, I think that request coming in a session where everybody's fighting over money probably didn't play very well. But it's hard to say. I mean, the reason I think it's hard to say is, remember that $3 million only buys peace in part of his civil litigation, and really not the most serious part of it. He still has other whistleblower claims ongoing against other former employees at the AG's office. And so the question could then be, okay, great, you worked out a settlement for $3 million for these guys. What happens to the rest? What's that going to be? And I think there would be some fear that you'd inevitably be coming back to the Treasury. So it would be a different reaction, but for practical reasons, it might be seen the same way.
And there's a DOJ investigation of him that's ongoing as well.
Yeah, let's not forget that either. And
right.
We just don't know anything about those investigations. The feds are notoriously tight-lipped. But again, the voters have known about that as much as you and I know about it. It's existed, and it didn't seem to faze anybody too much in this last election.
Does that surprise you at all, for all of this information to be on the table, for it to be out there as long as it has been on the table, and yet the voters, to your point, and Paxton and his supporters have pointed this out 3 times now, they have sent him back to that office?
Yeah, not really. I think that the claims against him are all relatively early in the process. For example, the civil litigation that was settled has been hung up on early procedural questions about the ability of those people to sue the state forever since the lawsuit was filed. The criminal case is still wandering around the state looking for a venue, last I checked. And so we don't really know that much about them. And so if you're a voter and you're inclined to like Mr. Paxton because of his politics or what have you, and you've got that you know about for sure, and weighed against that is kind of this fact that somebody filed a lawsuit, it's pretty easy to work that out in favor of Mr. Paxton. I think that's the political risk for him, aside of being impeached out of these upcoming proceedings, is real evidence will start coming out that has never been presented in these civil or criminal cases, and that may be a reason why he decides not to proceed with it or why he decides to go all in and fight really hard.
To that point, there was a statement the other day by one of the attorneys, the outside lawyers that the House has hired to bring the case against him, that perhaps what we're seeing really only scratches the surface.
Right. That's a speech that I think it was Rusty Hardin. He's probably given that speech 1,000 times for various lawsuits he's had coming up. It's kind of classic plaintiff's lawyer talk in a high-profile case. I'm not knocking him for that. That's just what you do to try to sell your story. But I'll believe it when I see it. That talk's cheap, and we'll see what kind of evidence they actually put on. And I think that's what the Paxton side of the fence is saying is, okay, great, you can talk to the microphone, but what are you really going to have when it's time to put on the evidence, and how are you going to present it to a room full of senators, some of whom aren't very interested in hearing what you have to say?
The New York Times called this a political earthquake in Texas. Hyperbole, or is that accurate?
I'm not sure of the New York Times. I'm surprised the New York Times could find Texas to talk about its politics to start with. But more seriously, does it profoundly shake up the Texas political landscape? No. The Republicans still control the houses of government, houses of the legislature where all this is going on. The governor's still Republican. The big picture hasn't changed. It is historic. As you point out, it's only the third time since 1876, with a very, very colorful history and all kinds of hard-fought political struggles, giant personalities. It's only the third time this has ever happened, and that's historic. And what we're doing now is going to be studied in history books in another 50 years when the next impeachment comes along. So I think it's very notable mainly for historic reasons, and those are very significant. This just doesn't happen every day.
You mentioned the Texas Senate, which is the next stop for this. And my understanding is the Senate has to schedule a trial by August 28th?
That sounds right. By statute, there's a certain number of days that go by once they've been formally advised of the House's vote.
And you need 2/3
Correct.
in order to convict, so that would be 21 of 31.
Yes, assuming that all 31 sit, of course. And there are some questions about who's going to be there. Is Angela Paxton going to
His wife.
take the oath? Yeah, is she going to take the oath? Will she be allowed to take the oath? We don't know the answers to those questions. And there may be other senators who've worked closely with Mr. Paxton over the years or have business relationships with him who feel uncomfortable with hearing his case. Or maybe they're even involved in some of the situations that are at issue. I have no idea. But there are going to be some serious questions about recusal that need to be asked and answered before we know if 31 is the right number.
Okay, good point. So we have to watch the math and keep track of that.
That's right. Just do the math and then multiply it by 2/3.
Changing topics for just a moment, or for more than just a moment. You have written about something else that came out of the legislature this year, which is our new system of business courts in Texas. Yes. Can you just briefly, for the novices, and I'm counting myself among that group, can you outline what the legislature did in creating this new level of the judicial system?
Sure. Let's go back in time a little bit to get the historical framework for it. There was a time when Texas, all counties had the same thing. Every county had a district court or a few district courts, depending on how big they were. That district court heard everything, criminal, civil, family, you name it. As time went on, it became clear in the larger cities that that wasn't very efficient and that it was a good idea to have specialization. So you had criminal and civil split off from each other, family courts split off additionally, Probate courts have split off because of the specialized nature of that practice. And here in Dallas, we have a number of county-level courts. That unit of organization has stayed the same. But as you know, if you've ever been called to jury duty, there's a civil courthouse downtown. There's a criminal courthouse on the other side of the river or close to the other side of the river. And they're physically separate in addition to being separate by what they have jurisdiction over. The legislature in this term added to the mix another specialty. So there's civil, there's criminal, there's family, and now we have business courts, commercial courts. And there's a very intricate definition for what is a commercial dispute. But the idea is that just as civil and criminal cases have different needs and should be tried in different fora, sophisticated business cases have their own unique needs as well and need to have judges that are specialized in that area of law and other procedures designed to help that kind of case move along. And that's a trend that has been proceeding across the country since Delaware pioneered that idea a number of years ago. Probably, loosely speaking, half of our states have something like that, some kind of specialized court for commercial cases. And so that's what we have find ourselves with now, is the legislature has added another county-level specialization to the court system, consistent with a national trend of doing that. It's also added a specialized court of appeals on top of that that's just going to hear business court cases.
The opinions, and I'm going back to the testimony, going back to, I believe, April, when there was testimony in Austin about the prospect of this. And there were people who argued, as you just articulated, that this would be a good thing, that these are important cases, that businesses want to know that they're in front of courts that understand the issues and can process the issues. Trial lawyers, and not to cast a broad brush here or paint with one, but there were people who objected, saying you're creating a two-tiered system of justice, one for business and one for everybody else. What do you make of those arguments?
There are serious questions on both sides of this. There have been experiments and practices in other states involving business courts that have seemed to have gone okay, but Texas is its own unique animal. And one side of the coin, as you point out, is an argument that commercial disputes need some special handling because of their complexity. But on the other hand, there are political arguments that the reason we've had this county-based system for a long time is something to do with dispute resolution, but also has to do with the people of that county enforcing their own law through the jury system and through the judges that they elect. And this kind of new court system takes power away from that and moves it somewhere else. And I think there's also, some of this is what the trial lawyer said, some is from other sources, but there's sort of an intellectual concern about, are you really going to be making things simpler and more streamlined and better for business by adding yet more stuff onto a system that's already fairly complicated? So there are legitimate questions that remain to be answered about whether this is a fair system to the people in these areas so they're going to be having these business cases, and whether they're really going to work to achieve the desired ends, and we're just not going to know for a few years.
You've written about the challenge that the state faces in creating these courts.
It's particularly true at the appellate level. We have an interesting statistic is that the United States has one Supreme Court and 13 intermediate courts of appeals. Texas has 2 Supreme Courts, one civil, one criminal, and now 15 intermediate courts of appeals. 14 of those have a geographic region. Dallas, Houston has 2 for some reason, Austin, so forth. The 15th Court of Appeals, the one that will hear appeals in business cases, has a statewide jurisdiction. It's the only Court of Appeals to have that, and it's starting from scratch. In the past, when we've had new courts, they've always broken off from some other court. The Dallas court area, for example, used to be really big, and we've broken off this district and that district. And so when you start a court by breaking it off from another one, you've got a bunch of law built in. The earlier court has all this precedent. But here, you've got the 15th Court of Appeals starting with 0. There's nothing in the tank. And obviously, our state Supreme Court's opinions will be binding on that court, but below that level, they're going to have some discretion on deciding what they're going to follow and what they're not going to follow. And those are going to be some very difficult and important decisions very early in the life of that court.
Is it possible then that you could end up in a situation where this doesn't necessarily resolve problems but creates a new level of them?
That is a risk. The argument, I think, by the proponents of business courts is this isn't really rocket science. The principles that they need to get off the ground are well known, well established, and pretty much the law everywhere. And the question going forward is just applying those principles in a uniform way to the many complex fact patterns that can come up in business cases. The argument the other way by critics of this new court is you've got to be kidding. We've got 14 courts already that are struggling with all this, and having a 15th court isn't going to be the magic fix. And there's inevitably going to be some personal bias that works its way into this process of getting off the ground and picking the initial precedents that will guide the decisions of the court. And so, again, we're just going to have to wait and see. We have the court now. There's no more arguing about that. But what they're going to do to sort of fill up the cupboard that doesn't have anything in it is going to be very important. Are they going to do it in an objective way where everybody can kind of see what the rules are and how it's going, or are they just doing it by what they think is good for the case at hand? The first has a good chance of working. The second is going to get a lot of criticism if that's how it proceeds. My focus is at the appellate level, so I'm going to be waiting and seeing. It's going to take a while to get the appeals in there. And this question of what law do you apply, it's really something. I mean, I just can't think of an example of a court like that in recent memory. Our Texas experience has always been dividing a court. In the last century, I think the only federal court created new federal circuit court was the 11th, which broke off from the 5th back in the early 80s. And there again, you had a whole body of law from the old 5th Circuit to draw on. So having a startup court of appeals is really a once-in-a-lifetime thing to watch. I think it's going to be fascinating.
I think the notion of a court as a startup is fascinating in and of itself.
You don't see that every day. And it's an interesting, you're not really entrepreneurial. You've got plenty of business, and the state pays all the salaries. But you're going to have to come at it a little bit differently. You can't just walk in and expect everything to work. And very simple things like, what case do we cite for XYZ routine proposition? Well, the Dallas court's got some case they always cite because that's just the one they've always used. What do you do? And if you cite the Dallas case, not the Houston case, is everybody going to get mad at you? You just have to think through a lot of issues that people have just never thought through.
David, in one of your thoughts on this, you said you're in essence creating a court from scratch.
Yes.
As someone who has spent as much time as you have in litigation, doing appellate work, what fears does that prompt in your mind when you're creating a court system from scratch?
The first question is you're finding the people. You've got to get judges to sit there, and they have to have staff that they're comfortable with. That's straightforward enough, but it's critical that you find people that are interested not only in serving on a court as a judge, but the people are interested in serving on this court at this time as a judge. You could have somebody who's very good at a standard Court of Appeals job who's just not quite cut out for the startup role. And that's a question that we need to keep in mind, that our government needs to keep in mind, and we as voters need to keep in mind as we go forward with this. But then the question is going to be, how do you pick the controlling precedent when you get beyond an issue that the state Supreme Court has squarely addressed? What happens when you look at an issue, the Supreme Court's given some general guidance, the Dallas Court of Appeals has come out one way, and the El Paso Court of Appeals has come out the other way. Is the 15th Court of Appeals going to follow Dallas or El Paso in that situation? What criteria are they going to use to make their decision? And we don't really have a playbook for that. You don't start new courts every day. And so these judges are going to have to state some criteria that make it look like they're making an intelligent and thoughtful choice and not just throwing darts at the wall. And they're certainly going to say the right things. I have every confidence in that. But whether they're actually doing it is going to be a difficult challenge. It's going to be something that observers will be watching very closely.
My understanding, please correct me if I'm incorrect in this, is that it's going to take a couple of years to get these courts up and operating.
For sure. I mean, it's not an easy thing to start up a court in the first place. You have to have all the clerical assistants and court reporters and courtrooms and all of that. And then at the appeal level, you don't just start with an appeal, right? You have to have things that get appealed to it. So no matter how diligent folks are in getting the business courts off the ground, it's just going to be a while before anything gets to the new Court of Appeals, and then it's going to be longer before really significant things get there. There'll probably be some emergency motion filed the first day the 15th Court is open, but for it to get like, say, the Dallas Court of Appeals is today, where it's coming out every day with a half dozen new opinions, that's going to take a while because there's just going to be a pretty substantial ramp-up time there.
Do you have clients, are there corporations out there that are seeing this debate and now seeing the legislation passed? Are there corporations that are calling you up and asking about this?
I think a lot of people are in wait-and-see mode, to be honest. I think there were a lot of lobbies that thought this is generally a good idea and promoted it. Many of the proponents of it, the people that supported the law, had their own idiosyncratic reasons. They had a bad experience with a court somewhere, or their headquarters is in a jurisdiction and they don't like the court, something like that. And now that they've actually got it, they're not all that sure kind of what comes next. So the big question right now is what exactly is going to be in the new business court. There's this long definition. It is the kind of thing only a legislature could love. It's got a little bit of this, a little bit of that, a little bit of the other. And how that's going to play out in practice is just going to take some work. I think the question right now is let's wait and see. And let's see what really ends up being in these courts. That could take years to really know where we end up on that.
In the meantime, then, what is your best advice for a corporation or a corporate officer who may be wondering what to do with regard to a dispute?
Yeah, I think the people that make decisions about litigation for businesses always have a choice of options, or often do. There's often a chance to take a case that might proceed in court and seek to invoke a right of arbitration. Oftentimes, that's pretty clear. Sometimes it's not. Do you want to have a fight about that? If you go to court, do you want to have a jury? Do you want to have a judge? Do you engage in mediation or some kind of alternative dispute resolution? Do you not? This just adds another choice to the portfolio. And I think that process of making choices, in-house counsel are very good at, and litigators are very good at. It's just another thing to consider. I don't think it's revolutionary, but I think it just adds a different element that in some cases could be important and in others is really not a big deal.
All right. Let's stay with the legislature, which we can do because as we record this at the beginning of June, our Texas legislature is once again back in session in a special session. And in this case, we're seeing another, example of a rift among the Republican leadership, that we've got a debate going on between the lieutenant governor and the governor over property taxes.
Yes, we do. And, I don't know what to tell you about that. There's certainly agreement on the general outlines that the Republican leadership of the state wants to have what they call property tax relief. The question is how much. And that comes down to dollars and cents at the end of the day. Both sides of that want to claim a big number that they can give to voters the next time they're up for election, but they're going to have to answer to the voters too if the state agencies can't pay their light bills because they don't have any money. And that is the choice, and there's a lot of horse trading going on. I haven't been watching that particular issue that closely because I think what's being negotiated about is really not a public matter. They're just trying to reach some kind of compromise between those positions where everybody can end up with a number they can live with and everybody can still live up with an acceptable amount of income into the state government.
But when you see the dispute among Republicans over this property tax issue, and you juxtapose that with the recent impeachment by the Republican House of a Republican Attorney General. Does that indicate there's trouble there in River City, or is that just us prognosticating a little too much as we look in at the process?
No, the state government is overwhelmingly Republican and pretty conservative Republican. I think if you had a 1 to 10, 1 being liberal, 10 being very conservative, our state government's somewhere around a 7.5. And the debate we're having here is between the 8s and the 7.25. I mean, yes, there's a vigorous debate about property tax, and yes, they all got mad at Ken Paxton and voted to impeach him, but, those are relatively minor ideological disputes. I don't think there's anything there. It's really out of the mainstream for the Republican Party. Also in the special session, the legislature is considering it's a criminal law that would criminalize at the state level illegal entry into the United States. That obviously is a federal crime already. If it's a state crime, then state law enforcement authority can enforce that law and put you in a state prison or something as a penalty for violating that law. And I get where they're coming from. The state has been trying very hard to get around the constitutional principle that immigration is solely a federal matter, exclusively a federal matter. And it is true that the same conduct can often be a violation of both state and federal criminal law. If I rob a bank, I've violated both state and federal laws. But the problem here, though, is the crime of being someplace, when that place is the United States, definitionally gets you back where you started again. There can't be a crime for being in Texas because you have a right to travel freely between states in this country, and the crime of being in the United States, by its very nature, requires the United States to enforce it. So I think that's a creative use of a well-recognized principle, but it's going to get right back in the same problem that virtually everything else that's come out of the legislature this term about border security has come into. It's just very hard for a state to do much that doesn't conflict with the federal government's exclusive authority over immigration. And there's just no way around that. There's one country, there can only be one policy. There can't be 50 different immigration policies.
Is it potentially another issue where politics is driving what's going on, even though from the reality standpoint, it's just not going to get that far down the road?
I think immigration and a perceived crisis at the border is a very hot-button issue with Texas voters. In the primary for this last election, I'd watch the commercials sometime. Every single commercial, the people said they'd be tough on the border. The state controller candidate said he'd be tough on the border. He was going to write a lot of checks. I guess he was going to throw checks at people. But that's the thing. That they'd all done their focus groups and concluded that was the issue that that people really care about. And you can look at this footage on the news of these people that are obviously in crisis, trying desperately to get into the country. People react to that. They respond emotionally. So I think that's political red meat to pass laws that are perceived as dealing with that. And they may even work if they can find a loophole or a way to phrase the law to get around the principle that the federal government controls immigration. But they are, by and large, doomed from the outset. And they're kind of feel-good measures because states just can't be countries and have their own immigration policies.
A couple of final issues I just want to run through very quickly if we can. There was an awful lot of talk about potentially legislation around guns, restriction of firearms or the lack thereof. We really didn't see an awful lot of movement in this legislative session, notwithstanding the awful tragedy in Uvalde.
Yes, and in Allen recently. I mean, we have these tragedies, and people mourn what happens, and then they just kind of move on. Everyone says, well, that was terrible, but it's not going to happen to me. And they move on down the road. And people have very strong feelings about the rights to freely own firearms in this state. That's much more immediate to most people than a remote threat that someone walks into a mall and shoots at them. And that's just the way it goes. People see the risk that way to them, minimal risk from doing something, substantial harm from infringing on their rights with firearms. They vote accordingly, and the legislators respond accordingly. So whatever solution we're going to have as a society, this problem of gun violence and these shooters, there are solutions out there that academics talk about, but meaningful restrictions on ownership and sale of firearms is just not going to be one, certainly at the state level in Texas. Other things have to be proposed and done. It's just not politically feasible. We may wish it was. It's not. Move on.
Does it indicate at all that our democracy is broken or that a portion of it is not functioning properly if you and I can sit here and see what happened in Allen and see what happened in Uvalde, and yet the political will has not changed? Or is that the way our democracy is meant to work?
I'm not particularly surprised. I think it's in economics, I think it's a concept of an externality where in economics, supply and demand, you and I negotiate, the market works, and we end up with a fair price, and everybody's resources get allocated fairly, except when our activities cause something that we don't have to pay for. The classic example of that is pollution. You and I have a transaction by which I refine oil and send it on to gasoline. We have a great business. We have a great price because the free market set that price. But the externality we create is pollution. My refinery dumps oil, the cars that you put gas in put stuff into the atmosphere, and that creates real hardship that we don't have to pay for. Same thing here. There's a free market in firearm sales and firearm ownership. People buy and sell their firearms, no particular consequences to that. But the more firearms are out there, the greater the chance is that some troubled person is going to get a firearm and misuse it. So I don't think that the regular free market solution or the majority rules approach that our democracy is based on is designed to handle this kind of challenge. That's why you create regulatory agencies, is to resolve externalities like that. And that may be what we have to do to try to mitigate this problem. Although, it is never going to work to have a national bureau of gun registration or anything like that. But we can't be looking to the market to solve this problem or to the majority to solve it. It's something that is happening kind of outside of people's vision, but is nevertheless very serious.
Another issue, and the legislature did pass something on this. It passed a ban on treatment of transgender youth.
Yes, I saw that.
Okay. Just today, we're recording this at the beginning of June. A federal judge in Florida set aside a similar piece of legislation that the Florida legislature passed. Does that portend anything for us here in Texas, or do we just look at it and say different state, different courts, different appellate court?
Well, yes. So people have written about this during the legislative debate about this law and in other states as well. There are potential constitutional challenges to these laws. There are equal protection arguments saying that transgender youth need to be treated the same as everybody else. There are due process arguments about the inherent human need for health care and why that's something government can't unreasonably restrict. All of those are a little gray when applied to this setting, though. The transsexual community, the transgender community is relatively small and new in our political scene in the United States. There isn't a lot of case law that applies traditional equal protection concepts to that community. And so it sort of remains to be seen whether these theoretical constitutional challenges really have legs. And here in Texas, we find ourselves in probably the most conservative federal appellate court in the U.S. on such matters, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit. And my guess is that if confronted with an appeal from a case involving one of these laws, they would not be inclined to read the equal protection or due process clause expansively because they just haven't done that in other areas of law either, meaning it would be up to the U.S. Supreme Court ultimately if they felt there was something to these constitutional challenges to take a case from the Fifth Circuit and someplace else and resolve that conflict.
David, thank you. I always enjoy the opportunity to sit down and chat.
Thank you very much. I really appreciated the chance to visit with you.
That's David Coale with Lynn Pinker Hurst Schwegmann here in Dallas. You can check out his own podcast, Coale Mind, anywhere you get your podcasts. That's Coale, C-O-A-L-E-M-I-N-D, where David breaks down today's hot-button constitutional issues. You can visit lynnllp.com for more information about the firm. That's lynnllp.com. Make sure to like us on Facebook, subscribe to us on YouTube, and tune in next time to Keep It Legal. I'm your host, Mark Anik. We'll see you then.